Picture this. It's May 1481. Constantinople, the city that Mehmed II conquered 28 years ago and rebuilt into the gleaming capital of the most powerful empire on earth. The minarets catch the first pale light of morning. The Bosphorus below the Topkapi Palace walls smells of salt and fish and the faint, acrid residue of the city's endless forges. It is a city of 500,000 souls, the largest in the world outside of China. And it hums even before dawn, with the sound of a civilization at its absolute peak. And then the word spreads. Quietly at first. A whisper from a palace physician to a chamberlain to a eunuch to a vizier's servant. And within hours, the whisper has become a shockwave rolling through every street, every bazaar, every barracks, every mosque. The Sultan is dead. Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who shattered Constantinople's walls at 21 years old, the man who led armies into Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, the Crimea, into Anatolia, into Italy, is dead. He was 49 years old. He died on campaign, in the field, in a tent on the road near Gebze, and nobody is entirely sure what killed him. Some say illness, some say poison. The physicians are very careful about what they say. You are standing in the Janissary barracks when you hear the news. You are a seasoned soldier. You have fought under this man's red and gold banner in 3 campaigns. You have stood inside the walls of cities that no army was supposed to be able to take. You believed, everyone believed, that Mehmed was something close to invincible. Not because you were naive, but because you had seen what he could do. And now, he is gone. And in the stunned silence that follows the news, every professional soldier in that barracks is thinking the same thought. Who comes next? And what happens to all of us when the answer turns out to be wrong? What comes next is a catastrophe disguised as a transition. What comes next is a civil war, a poisoning plot, a succession battle that will spill blood from Constantinople to Cairo, and ultimately ignite one of the most consequential conflicts of the 15th century, the Ottoman-Mamluk Wars. A war that will determine who controls the Middle East, who controls the spice routes, who controls the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and ultimately, which empire survives to dominate the coming century. This is the story of what happens when the greatest ruler of an age dies and leaves behind 2 sons who both want his throne. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly these kinds of stories. The turning points that most people don't know. The crises that remade the world. Hit that subscribe button now because we are just getting started. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. I read every single one. And let's go back to 1481, where an empire is about to tear itself apart. Before we go any further, you need to understand what is actually at stake here. Because the death of Mehmed II and the crisis that followed was not a simple palace drama about 2 brothers fighting over a crown. It was something much larger and much more dangerous. By 1481, the Ottoman Empire is not just a regional power, it is the axis around which the entire known world revolves. Its territory stretches from the Danube River in the north to the edges of the Arabian Peninsula in the south. It controls both shores of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait where Europe and Asia press together, which means it controls the single most important choke point in global trade. Every ship carrying grain from the Black Sea, every caravan carrying silk and spice from the east, every merchant wanting to move goods between Asia and Europe, operates under the shadow of the Ottoman Crescent. The empire's military is the finest in the world. Its Janissaries, slave soldiers raised from childhood to know nothing but war and loyalty to the Sultan, are the most disciplined infantry on the planet. Its cavalry can cover 100 miles in 3 days. Its navy controls the eastern Mediterranean. Its artillery engineers are so advanced that European powers send spies to steal their cannon-casting secrets. And at the southern edge of this colossus, controlling Egypt, controlling Syria, controlling the holy cities of the Hejaz, sits the Mamluk Sultanate, another empire built on slave soldiers, another empire with centuries of military tradition, smaller than the Ottomans, older than the Ottomans, and watching the Ottoman succession crisis with eyes that are calculating something very carefully. Here is what makes this specific moment so explosive. The Mamluks and the Ottomans share a border in Anatolia, in the region called Cilicia and the Taurus Mountains. And that border has been a source of friction for decades. Under Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottomans pushed steadily southward, gobbling up the small principalities that buffered them from direct contact with Mamluk territory. The Mamluks watched this happen and worried. They watched a man who had just taken Constantinople, the impregnable city, the seat of the Roman Empire. And they asked themselves the obvious question: if he can take Constantinople, what can't he take? Mehmed's death answers that question by creating a new one. With the empire in crisis, with 2 princes racing toward Constantinople to seize the throne, does the Mamluk Sultan strike? Does he press the advantage? Does he test the new, uncertain Ottoman ruler while the empire is still finding its feet? That question will shape the next 50 years of Middle Eastern history. And the answer will come out of one of the most brutal, intricate, and underappreciated military conflicts of the entire 15th century. Think about that scale. We are talking about the future of the Middle East, the future of the holy cities, the future of the spice trade. All of it balanced on the knife edge of one emperor's death and 2 sons' ambitions. To understand the crisis of 1481, we need to understand the man who created it by being so magnificent that no one could possibly succeed him cleanly. Mehmed II was born in 1432, the 3rd son of Sultan Murad II, and for most of his early childhood, he was not expected to matter. Ottoman succession was brutal and practical. Whoever could seize and hold the throne would rule, and the losers typically died. Mehmed's older brothers were the serious candidates. He was the spare. But his older brothers died. First Ahmed, then Ali, under circumstances that history records, but does not fully illuminate. And suddenly, Mehmed, the young prince who had been educated in relative obscurity, who had been sent to govern a provincial town in Anatolia at age 11, who was considered too young and too untested, was the heir. Murad II brought him back to Constantinople, took one look at his son, and reportedly experienced the uneasy feeling of a man who has created something he cannot entirely control. Mehmed was brilliant in ways that were genuinely unusual. He spoke 6 languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He read philosophy, science, and military theory with equal hunger. He could recite Persian poetry and calculate artillery trajectories. He was, by any measure, the most intellectually formidable Ottoman prince in generations. He was also absolutely ruthless. When Murad died in 1451 and Mehmed came to the throne at 19, his first act was to have his infant half-brother drowned in the bath. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was Ottoman political logic. A rival prince, however young, was a potential rallying point for any faction that wanted to challenge the Sultan. The fratricide law that the Ottomans operated under said clearly, secure the throne first, mourn later. Mehmed secured the throne. Then he did what no one had done in 1,000 years. He looked at the walls of Constantinople and decided they could come down. The story of the 1453 siege has been told many times, and rightly so, because it was one of the most dramatic military operations in human history. A young sultan, 21 years old, deploying the largest cannon ever cast to that point, the monster bronze barrel cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, firing stone balls weighing over 600 pounds against walls that had turned back every attacker for 11 centuries. The siege lasted 53 days. On May 29, 1453, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the breach. The medieval world ended on that Tuesday morning in May. What followed was 3 decades of conquest so consistent, so relentless, that it began to feel almost mechanical. Serbia, the Peloponnese, Trebizond, the last fragment of the Byzantine world, Bosnia, Albania, fought over for decades against the legendary Gjergj Kastrioti, the Albanian lord whom the Ottomans called Skanderbeg, and whom they feared more than any other man alive. The Crimean Khanate, brought into Ottoman orbit, Wallachia, Rhodes, besieged and, uniquely for Mehmed, not taken. That failure at Rhodes in 1480 was one of the very few blemishes on a record of near-total victory. The Knights Hospitalier, those warrior monks with their red and white cross, held out against a massive Ottoman fleet and army. It was an embarrassment, and Mehmed was already planning his return when he died. He died before he could fix it. There is something deeply poetic about that failure. Rhodes was the one place where the sheer weight of Ottoman power had been insufficient, where a small garrison of fanatical defenders on a rocky island had held out against a fleet that dwarfed anything the knights could put to sea. Mehmed had taken it personally. He had sat in his campaign tent and watched his soldiers die on the walls and refused to withdraw. And then winter came, and illness came through the camp, and eventually, the practical necessity of stopping overrode his determination. He left. He told his commanders to prepare for a return. He was going to go back in 1481 and finish it. He would not get the chance. And now, here is the thing you need to understand about what Mehmed left behind. He had built an empire of extraordinary sophistication and power. He had also built it around himself, personally, around his vision, his energy, his terrifying personal authority. The administrative and military systems he put in place were excellent, but they were calibrated for a sultan who was supremely competent and supremely feared. What happened when the sultan was a different kind of man? What happened when the central authority that held all of it together was suddenly, violently vacant? You got what happened in 1481. While the Ottoman court descended into crisis, in Cairo the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay was watching. And Qaitbay was not a man who wasted opportunities. Let's talk about who the Mamluks actually were, because this is a civilization that most people in the West don't know nearly enough about. The word Mamluk means owned in Arabic, referring to the fact that these were military slaves, purchased as boys from the steppes of Central Asia, from the Caucasus, from the Russian and Ukrainian territories north of the Black Sea, converted to Islam, trained from childhood in horsemanship and warfare, and formed into one of the most formidable military castes in human history. This system had produced the men who stopped the Mongols. Think about that for a moment. The Mongols, who had destroyed Baghdad, burned the Abbasid Caliphate, swept everything before them from China to Poland, marched into Egypt in 1260. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in the hills of Galilee, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars met them, and the Mongols lost. For the first time in their history, a Mongol army was not just stopped, but driven back. The Mamluks had done what no one else could do. 220 years later, that tradition was still very much alive. Qaitbay came to the Mamluk throne in 1468, 13 years before Mehmed's death, and he had proved himself one of the most capable rulers the Sultanate had seen in generations. He was old. He had been purchased as a slave in his youth and risen through the ranks over decades, and by 1481, he was somewhere between 60 and 70 years old, his face lined by decades of political maneuvering and military campaigning. But his mind was sharp, and his judgment was cold. Under Qaitbay, the Mamluk military had been reorganized and modernized, at least partially. The core of his army remained the heavy cavalry that had always been the Mamluk signature, armored horsemen trained from childhood in the composite bow, the lance, and the saber, capable of delivering devastating mounted archery at speed. These men were not conscripts. They were professionals who had spent their entire lives preparing for war. Their horsemanship was extraordinary, even by the standards of an age when most men could ride before they could walk. Qaitbay also invested in firearms. This is important. The traditional Mamluk cavalry culture had an ambivalent relationship with gunpowder weapons. There was a cultural pride in the warrior who depended on his own skill, not a machine. But Qaitbay was pragmatic enough to understand that the Ottomans' artillery advantage was real and dangerous. He brought in craftsmen. He established foundries. He built, or tried to build, an artillery capacity that could match what the Ottomans could field. He did not fully succeed, and that failure would matter. But in 1481, the Mamluk military still controlled Egypt, the wealthiest province in the Middle East, the agricultural engine that fed the region, the trade hub where the Red Sea routes from India and the Spice Islands met the Mediterranean routes to Europe. Cairo under Qaitbay was a city of architectural magnificence. His own mosque complex still stands today, one of the masterpieces of Islamic architecture, its minaret slender as a needle against the sky above the old city. This was not a declining power. This was a civilization at its own peak. And this was the empire that was going to take advantage of the Ottoman chaos that Mehmed II's death had just created. Imagine standing there on the battlements of the citadel of Cairo, looking north across the delta. You are a Mamluk officer. You have trained for 20 years. You have fought in 3 campaigns. And you know, with the professional certainty of a man who has spent his life thinking about war, that the empire to your north is currently tearing itself apart. The question is not whether to act. The question is how fast to move and where to strike first. The moment Mehmed II closed his eyes on May 3rd, 1481, 2 clocks started ticking simultaneously in 2 different cities, and the man who ran faster would live. The man who ran slower would die. His 2 surviving sons were Bayezid and Cem, half-brothers, both legitimate, both ambitious, both absolutely aware that there was only one throne, and that Ottoman tradition had a very clear answer to the question of what happened to the prince who did not reach it first. Bayezid was the older. He was 33 years old in 1481, and he was governing the province of Amasya in northern Anatolia. He was a serious, studious man, deeply religious, genuinely interested in poetry and Sufi mysticism, far more contemplative in temperament than his father had been. He was not a warmonger by nature. He preferred the company of scholars and holy men to the brutality of battlefield command. His critics, and there were many at court, called him soft. His supporters called him wise. The truth was somewhere between the two. Cem was 21 years old and governed the province of Konya in central Anatolia. He was everything his brother was not. Impulsive, magnetic, physically impressive, a superb horseman and swordsman who had inherited something of his father's charismatic recklessness. He also believed with the absolute conviction of a young man who has never had his confidence seriously tested, that he was the better candidate. Not just better, that he was his father's true heir in spirit, and that Bayezid would make the empire weak. He was right about one thing. Bayezid would be a very different sultan than Mehmed. He was wrong about what that meant. The news of Mehmed's death reached Bayezid first. His father's Grand Vizier, Karamani Mehmed Pasha, a man who despised Bayezid and supported Cem, had been holding the news in Constantinople for as long as he dared. But the Janissaries found out before he could act on whatever plan he had in mind. And the Janissaries had opinions. The Janissaries were technically the Sultan's personal household troops, bound by loyalty to him alone. But they were also an institution with their own interests, their own internal politics, their own sense of what made a sultan useful to them. They did not want Cem. Cem was his father's son, aggressive, reformist, likely to make the army bleed in a dozen new campaigns. Bayezid was more conservative. He was the candidate who was likely to reward them generously, reduce their casualties, and let them be the powerful elite force they had always been, rather than using them as disposable shock troops in endless wars of expansion. The Janissaries murdered Karamani Mehmed Pasha in the palace, just dragged him out and killed him. That is how cleanly they made their political preferences known. Bayezid received the news, mounted his horse, and rode hard for Constantinople. He covered the distance from Amasya in an extraordinary forced march. Days of riding with minimal rest, changing horses at relay stations, pushing himself and his escort to the absolute edge of human endurance. The roads through northern Anatolia in May were dust and stone, the sun already fierce. The villages watching this column of hard-riding men pass with the expressionless silence of people who have learned not to ask questions about who is in a hurry and why. When he arrived at the capital and the Janissaries greeted him with their support, the throne was effectively his. And here is something worth pausing on. Bayezid's ride to Constantinople is, in miniature, the story of every succession. The moment between the old ruler's death and the new ruler's arrival is the most dangerous interval in the life of any empire. It is the moment when every faction, every rival, every foreign power calculates whether the new arrangement can be challenged. Bayezid's hard riding, his refusal to wait, his commitment to physical speed as a political act, was one of the most important decisions of his reign. And he made it before he had even sat down on the throne. He understood that in those first hours and days, presence was everything. But Cem did not accept it. This is where the human story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Cem Sultan, and that honorific Sultan, is important because he insisted on it, insisted on his legitimacy, launched his own bid for the throne with the energy of a man who genuinely believed he was in the right. He raised troops in Anatolia. He marched on Bursa, the old Ottoman capital, and took it. He issued coins in his own name, a declaration of sovereignty as clear as any speech. He sent his brother a proposal: divide the empire. I take Anatolia, you keep the European provinces. We share the inheritance. Bayezid's answer was the answer of every Ottoman sultan who has ever faced such a proposal: no. What followed was a civil war, brief, sharp, and decided at the Battle of Yenişehir in June 1481. Bayezid's forces crushed Cem's army. Cem fled. And his flight took him somewhere that no one had anticipated. Somewhere that would turn a simple dynastic struggle into an international crisis that would tie European diplomacy in knots for the next 14 years. He fled to the Mamluks. Think about what that meant. The prince of the Ottoman dynasty, the son of the man who had been the Mamluks' greatest rival, riding into Cairo and asking Kite Bey for protection, for support. for an alliance that might put him back on the throne of the most powerful empire in the world. Qaitbay listened. He was too experienced a politician not to see the possibilities. A claimant to the Ottoman throne, sitting in Cairo, was a card he could play at any moment. A threat he could hold over Bayezid. A crisis he could open whenever it suited him. The Ottoman-Mamluk relationship, already strained by a decade of border friction in Anatolia, had just become enormously more complicated. And in the mountain passes of Cilicia, where the two empires' territories pressed against each other, soldiers on both sides were already sharpening their weapons. The immediate trigger for open warfare between the Ottomans and the Mamluks was not Cem Sultan, though he certainly complicated everything. It was a dispute over a piece of territory that most people have never heard of. The Principality of Dulkadirids, a small Turkoman state in the mountainous region between Mamluk Syria and Ottoman Anatolia, in the area the ancients called Commagene. The Dulkadirids were not a major power. They were a buffer, a vassal, but a vassal claimed by both empires simultaneously, each demanding tribute, each insisting on overlordship, each watching the other's influence in the region with narrowed eyes. Under Mehmed II, the Ottomans had been pressing steadily southward into this buffer zone. Mehmed had installed a friendly candidate as the Dulkadirid ruler and was tightening his grip on the principality when he died. Qaitbay had watched this process with increasing alarm. The Dulkadirids were the Mamluks' northern shield. If the Ottomans absorbed them completely, Ottoman forces would stand directly on the Syrian border. There would be nothing between Bayezid's army and Aleppo, the great commercial city that was the economic heart of Mamluk Syria. That was not something Qaitbay could accept. But Cem Sultan's arrival in Cairo had given Qaitbay a new card and had changed the calculation. As long as Cem was in Cairo, Bayezid could not push too hard on the southern frontier without risking Qaitbay using Cem as a weapon against him, funding a new invasion of Anatolia, sending the exiled prince back to stir up revolt. Bayezid knew this. He treaded carefully. He sent diplomatic missions to Cairo. He negotiated, and then Cem left. In 1482, after his initial stay in Cairo failed to produce the military support he needed for a serious invasion of the Ottoman heartland, Cem made the fateful decision to go to Rhodes, to the Knights Hospitallers, to the very Christian warriors that his father had tried and failed to destroy 2 years earlier. He submitted himself to the custody of the Knights, seeking Western Christian support for his claim to the Ottoman throne. The Knights were delighted. They had, quite literally, a hostage of extraordinary value, a legitimate Ottoman prince who could be used to keep the empire off balance indefinitely. Within a year, Cem had been transferred to the custody of the French king, and then to Rome, where successive popes would keep him as a political instrument for over a decade. Bayezid, with Cem now safely in Christian hands, and thus temporarily neutralized as a tool of Mamluk policy, lost the patience that had kept him cautious on the southern frontier. He had been subsidizing the Knights to keep Cem contained, paying an astonishing 45,000 ducats a year to the Pope through the Knights, essentially to keep his own brother imprisoned. The strain of that financial and political humiliation soured him deeply, and in Anatolia, the border skirmishes that had been simmering for years began to boil. In 1485, an Ottoman force pushed into the Dulkadirid territory with unmistakable intent. Not a raid, an occupation. Ottoman administrators arrived with the troops, tax collectors, the machinery of permanent absorption. Qaitbay received the reports in Cairo and made his decision. He sent the word north, prepare for war. There was also a deeper cultural dimension to the conflict that pure territorial analysis misses. The Mamluks saw themselves as the true protectors of Sunni Islam, the guardians of the Caliphate's legacy. the rulers who had driven out the Mongols and restored order to the Muslim heartland, the power that kept the holy cities safe and the pilgrimage routes open. The Ottomans, whatever their military achievements, were newcomers in Islamic terms. Their dynasty was barely 2 centuries old. Their sultans had ruled in the Balkans longer than they had ruled in Arabia. There was a legitimate question in the minds of Cairo's scholars and soldiers about who deserved the primacy of the Muslim world. The Ottoman expansion southward was not just a territorial threat. It was an ideological challenge, a claim implicit in every Ottoman army that marched toward the Taurus passes that the heirs of Osman were now the preeminent force in Islam, that they, not the descendants of Baybars and Kalawun and the great Mamluk sultans, should be the ones giving shape to the Islamic world. Qaitbay could not accept that, not the territory, and not the symbolism. The insult, if you want to identify the moment that made war inevitable, was not really one incident. It was the accumulated weight of Ottoman expansion, of Bayezid's southern push, of the friction over the Dulkadirid buffer state, of the years of diplomatic insults and border provocations. Empires do not go to war over single incidents. They go to war when the balance of frustrations tips past the point of diplomatic calculation. In 1485, that point was reached, and the armies began to move. The war that began in 1485 was fought in some of the most brutal terrain in the Middle East: the Taurus and anti-Taurus mountain ranges, the narrow passes of Cilicia, the scorching plains of northern Syria. This was not the open steppe where cavalry could sweep in great arcs. This was choke point country. Country where a few thousand men defending a mountain pass could hold an army of 50,000 for weeks. Country where supply lines stretched thin and broken, where summer heat turned campaigns into exercises in survival, and where the side that ran out of food first lost. The Ottoman military that marched south in 1485 was still formidable, but it was not the machine that Mehmed II had commanded. Bayezid was not his father in temperament or in operational genius. He delegated command to his viziers and regional governors, and the men he sent to fight the Mamluks were capable professionals, but not inspired ones. The force he committed to the southern campaign was built around the Janissary infantry at its core, those disciplined, elite musketeers and archers who had been the sharp edge of every Ottoman victory for 3 generations. Behind them came the Sipahi cavalry, the provincial horsemen who fought in exchange for land grants, armored in mail and plate, armed with composite bows and lances, and with them came the artillery. Ottoman field guns, smaller and more mobile than the great siege cannon that had cracked Constantinople's walls, but devastating in open battle. On paper, the Ottoman force should have been superior. It had the advantage of numbers and the advantage of gunpowder. The Janissaries were, man for man, among the finest infantry in the world. But the Mamluks were fighting on or near their home ground, and they had something the Ottomans underestimated: extraordinary cavalry skill. Mamluk horsemen were trained in a martial tradition called the Furusiya, a comprehensive system of mounted warfare that encompassed horsemanship, archery, lance work, swordsmanship, and the tactical use of cavalry formations that had been refined over 2 centuries of continuous conflict against Crusaders, Mongols, and every other enemy that had attempted to pierce the Middle East. A Furusiya-trained Mamluk cavalryman could fire 8 aimed arrows per minute from the saddle at the gallop. 8 per minute. In a culture where a skilled English longbowman on foot was considered exceptional, if he could achieve 10 aimed shots per minute, that number is staggering. These horsemen did not fight the way European cavalry fought. They did not simply charge in formation and try to break the enemy by mass and momentum. They moved in fluid, coordinated patterns. They would advance in line, firing as they came, then wheel away before contact, riding back to reload, then wheel again and advance. A Mamluk cavalry engagement looked less like a medieval charge and more like a storm, always moving, always dangerous, hitting from multiple angles, refusing to be pinned in a single exchange. Against Janissary infantry with firearms, this style had advantages and disadvantages. The firearms gave the Janissaries range and stopping power. A volley of musket fire could shred a cavalry charge. But the Mamluk horsemen rarely gave them the perfect, static target that mass firearms fire required. They were too mobile, too unpredictable. The war that resulted was a grinding, punishing series of engagements across 6 years. Neither side could deliver the knockout blow. The Ottomans would advance, take territory, then find the supply lines cutting out in the mountain passes. The Mamluks would counterattack, retake ground, then find themselves unable to push north of the Taurus without exposing their flanks to Ottoman forces in Anatolia. The first major engagement came in 1485, near the fortress city of Adana in the Cilician plain. The Mamluks struck fast before the Ottomans could consolidate their position, driving a hard cavalry assault into the Ottoman advance force. The Ottoman commander was killed. His force retreated in disorder. First blood to the Mamluks. The Ottomans reorganized and came back in 1486. They took Kayseri and pushed deeper into the frontier zone. The Mamluks responded with a devastating counteroffensive, catching an Ottoman force at a place called Achayura in the summer heat of 1488. The details of that battle are fragmentary. We know the outcome because the Ottoman commander died and the Janissaries that survived fell back in disorder. But the pattern was clear. In the mountain and foothill terrain where this war was being fought, the Mamluk cavalry had an edge that Ottoman firepower could not consistently overcome. The Ottomans reorganized and came back in 1486. They took Kayseri and pushed deeper into the frontier zone. The Mamluks responded with a devastating counteroffensive, catching an Ottoman force at a place called Ayachayuru in the summer heat of 1488. The details of that battle are fragmentary. We know the outcome because the Ottoman commander died, and the Janissaries that survived fell back in disorder. But the pattern was clear. In the mountain and foothill terrain where this war was being fought, the Mamluk cavalry had an edge that Ottoman firepower could not consistently overcome. There was a logistical dimension to this that is easy to overlook, but was decisive. Moving an Ottoman army from its bases in Anatolia down through the Taurus passes and into the Cilician plain required supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles through mountain country. Those supply lines were thin, vulnerable to Mamluk cavalry raids, and expensive to maintain. The Janissaries needed gunpowder, shot, food, and replacement equipment. All of it had to come from the north, through passes that Mamluk light cavalry could raid almost at will. In the first year of a campaign, when supplies were fresh and the army was full strength, the Ottomans were powerful. By the second or third year, when the wagons were running short and the men were hungry and the horses were worn, that was when the Mamluks pressed their advantage. The Mamluks understood this. They had fought in this terrain for generations, defending against Crusader attacks from the north and west, fighting the Mongols from the east. They knew that time and terrain were their allies. They did not have to win dramatic pitched battles. They had to survive long enough for the Ottoman logistics chain to break. Think about what it felt like to be an Ottoman soldier in those passes. The sun beating down from a white sky, the smell of dust and dried blood, the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the cliffs. But which direction? The Mamluks could appear from multiple angles, fire with devastating accuracy, and disappear into the terrain before a Janissary volley could be organized. It was not the orderly, disciplined clash of formations that Ottoman soldiers had been trained for. It was something more like ambush, relentless, exhausting, and deeply frightening. Neither empire could afford indefinite war. Both were bleeding treasure and men. And gradually, the outlines of a peace began to take shape. By 1490, both Bayezid and Bey were tired. Not in the way that weak men tire, but in the way that experienced leaders recognize when a war has exceeded its useful purpose and become an end in itself. Bey had achieved his primary objective. The Dulkadirid buffer zone had been preserved. Ottoman expansion into northern Syria had been checked. The Mamluks had demonstrated, clearly and convincingly, that they were not a power the Ottomans could simply steamroll on the way south. That demonstration had been costly. 6 years of campaigning in brutal terrain, thousands of Mamluk elite soldiers dead or wounded, the treasury strained, but it had been achieved. But here is where Bey made a mistake that empires often make after successful defensive wars. He began to believe that the defensive success meant something more than it did. He began to interpret the Ottoman retreat from the Taurus as evidence of Ottoman weakness, as confirmation that the crisis following Mehmed II's death had permanently diminished the empire. He was wrong, and the next generation would make that very clear. Because the Ottoman-Mamluk War of 1485 to 1491 was not the decisive conflict. It was the preliminary. A 6-year dress rehearsal for the real showdown that would come 25 years later, under a very different Ottoman Sultan. The peace agreement signed in 1491, called the Treaty of Peace between Bayezid II and Bey, restored borders more or less to the pre-war status quo. The Dulkadirids remained nominally independent, in practice under shared influence. Both empires withdrew their forces from the contested zone. Diplomats exchanged polite letters. It looked like a draw. It was a draw. But draws in imperial competition are never permanent. They are pauses. While Bey celebrated the preservation of the Mamluk position and the containment of Ottoman expansion, something more important was happening. The Ottoman Empire, bruised and embarrassed by 6 years of inconclusive fighting, began to learn. It began to change. Bayezid II, the cautious, mystical, scholarly sultan that his critics called weak, spent the years after 1491 rebuilding his navy, modernizing his artillery, and stabilizing the administrative machinery of the empire. He was not his father. No. He did not conquer Italy or threaten Vienna. But he also did not squander what his father had built. He consolidated. He deepened. He prepared, perhaps without fully knowing he was preparing, the structural foundations that his son Selim would use to finally break the Mamluk Sultanate completely. Bey died in 1496, 5 years after the peace. He was old, maybe 80 years old, though his exact age was never known even to himself, because enslaved boys from the Caucasus did not have birth certificates. He died in his palace in Cairo, having preserved his empire against the greatest threat it had faced in a generation. He was a remarkable man, but he died not knowing that the Mamluk Sultanate had perhaps 30 years left, not knowing that his empire's military conservatism, the cultural resistance to fully adopting gunpowder weapons, the elite cavalry culture that had produced miracles against the Mongols but would prove unable to adapt fast enough to the firearms revolution, had already planted the seeds of destruction. Not knowing that somewhere in the Ottoman palace, a child named Selim was growing up with his grandfather's drive and none of his father's restraint. A child who would one day be called Selim the Grim, and who would not stop at the Taurus Mountains. We are jumping forward slightly here, not to the full story of Selim. That deserves its own video, and I promise it is coming. But you need to know the ending to understand what the Ottoman crisis of 1481 truly meant. In 1516, 35 years after Mehmed II died in his tent outside Gebze, The Ottoman army that Selim I led south across the Taurus Mountains was a completely different instrument than the one Bayezid had sent against Qaitbay. Selim had learned from his father's failures. He had learned from 6 years of inconclusive war in the Cilician Mountains. He had learned, most importantly, that Mamluk cavalry skill could be overcome by superior firepower, if the firepower was modern enough, mobile enough, and deployed with sufficient tactical ruthlessness. He came with 500 field guns, organized into a mobile artillery train that could be moved and repositioned rapidly. He came with Janissaries trained in volley fire, coordinated musket volleys that could deliver a wall of lead at precise intervals, not the ragged individual fire that Mamluk cavalry could avoid. He came with a tactical doctrine designed specifically for the enemy he was facing. Let the Mamluks charge, absorb their momentum with disciplined infantry behind defensive lines, then hit them with concentrated artillery fire as they faltered. The Battle of Marj Dabik in August 1516 was over in a matter of hours. The Mamluk Sultan Kansu al-Ghauri died on the field. His army, perhaps the finest cavalry force in the Middle East, was shredded by Ottoman gunfire before it could close to effective range. The Mamluk charge, the magnificent, terrifying Furusiyya charge that had stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut 2.5 centuries earlier, ran headlong into Ottoman field artillery, firing prepared positions, and dissolved. A few months later, at Ridaniya near Cairo, the last Mamluk Sultan, Tumen Bey, tried again. He even attempted to copy Ottoman tactics, positioning his own cannons in advance, trying to turn Ottoman firepower back on itself. But the trap was set wrong. Selim's forces flanked the Mamluk position, and the battle became a rout. Tumen Bey was captured and hanged from the gate of Cairo. Egypt fell. Syria fell. The Hejaz, Mecca, Medina, the holy cities, fell under Ottoman suzerainty. The last Abbasid caliph in Cairo, a purely ceremonial figure whom the Mamluks had maintained for legitimacy, reportedly transferred the caliphate to Selim. Whether that transfer was real or manufactured, historians still debate it. The symbolic meaning was clear. The Ottomans were now the guardians of Islam's holiest places. They controlled the trade routes from India. They controlled Egypt's agricultural wealth. They were the undisputed masters of the Middle East. Short sentences now. The Mamluks were gone. Cairo was Ottoman. The Middle East had a new master. And it had all begun, this 35-year arc from the first Ottoman-Mamluk War to total Mamluk collapse, with a sultan dying in a tent on the road near Gebze, with 2 brothers racing toward a throne, with a crisis that looked like catastrophe, but was actually a crucible, burning away everything weak in the Ottoman system and leaving behind something harder and more dangerous. The Ottoman crisis of 1481 and the wars that followed it reshaped the world in ways we still live with today. Think about what the Mamluk collapse meant in practice. The Ottoman Empire, after 1517, controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline, Egypt, Syria, the holy cities, and the Red Sea approaches. This made the Ottomans the dominant power in the trade routes that connected Europe to India and the Spice Islands. Venetian merchants, Genoese merchants, the great commercial republics that had built their wealth on controlling the flow of Eastern goods into European markets, suddenly found their access to those routes dependent on Ottoman goodwill. This was not an abstraction. This was economics on a civilizational scale. The spice trade, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, was the oil of the late medieval world. Controlling the routes it traveled meant controlling enormous wealth. The Ottomans now sat astride those routes. They could tax, they could limit, they could redirect. And this pressure, this awareness in European capitals that the eastern trade routes were now solidly in Ottoman hands, was one of the accelerants that pushed European states to look for alternative paths, to look west, to look across the Atlantic Ocean, and ask whether there was another way to India. Columbus sailed in 1492. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reached India by sea in 1499. These voyages were not accidents. They were responses to the reality that the overland routes to Asia ran through an empire that was not friendly to Christian merchants. The Ottoman consolidation of the Middle East, which began with Mehmed II's conquests and accelerated through the Mamluk Wars, was one of the forces that pushed Europe into the Age of Discovery. Let that sink in for a moment. The civil war between Bayezid and Cem Sultan, the border skirmishes in the Cilician Mountains, the 6-year Ottoman-Mamluk War over a small Turkoman principality in the hills of Anatolia. These events, which most people have never heard of, contributed to the circumstances that sent European ships across oceans and connected the world. History does not move in straight lines. It moves in cascades. One crisis creates conditions for another decision, which creates circumstances for another event, which eventually reaches across continents and centuries to shape the world that people wake up in today. Bayezid II himself died in 1512, deposed by his own son Selim, the man who would finish what the Ottoman-Mamluk Wars had begun. The old Sultan, the scholar and mystic who had been called weak by his critics, was forced to abdicate and then died, possibly poisoned, the circumstances never resolved, on his way to retirement. There is a brutal irony in that ending. Bayezid had survived the chaos of his father's death, had fought off his brother, had contained the Mamluk challenge, had held the empire together through years of crisis. And then his own son pushed him aside and went on to the glory. Selim, who devoured his father's legacy, who broke the Mamluks and seized Cairo, who transformed the Ottoman Empire into the dominant power of the entire Muslim world, remembered by history as the Grim, the Conqueror, the Hard One. Bayezid remembered as the mild interlude between two warriors. Is that fair? Probably not. Bayezid did something harder than conquest. He preserved. He stabilized. He gave the empire 20 years to recover from the crisis of succession and the 6 years of Mamluk War. 20 years during which the military was rebuilt, the treasury was replenished, and the structural reforms that made Selim's conquests possible were quietly put in place. Great men are not always the ones who build the visible monuments. Sometimes they are the ones who hold things together in the years when everything threatens to fall apart. When the crisis comes, when the great founder dies and leaves behind a fractured court, rival heirs, dangerous enemies on every border, the quiet, steady man who keeps the machine running may matter more than the dramatic conqueror who comes after him. This is the lesson of 1481. I want you to take a moment and just consider the sweep of what we've covered today. A brilliant conqueror dies at 49. His two sons race to a throne in a contest where the loser will not simply retire. He will die, or he will spend his life as a political exile, begging for support in foreign courts. The empire that the conqueror built with 30 years of genius and blood suddenly faces its most dangerous period, not from an external enemy, but from the vacuum at its own center. And into that vacuum flows everything: Mamluk ambition, Janissary politics, Tatar intervention, European scheming, the endless, exhausting weight of governing an empire that stretches from the Danube to the Euphrates and holds together only as long as the Sultan at its center is feared, respected, and legitimate. Bayezid survived it. The empire survived it. And the Mamluk Wars that followed, grinding, inconclusive, brutal in their own way, served as the test that revealed the structural limits on both sides. The Mamluks found that their magnificent cavalry tradition, the tradition that had stopped the Mongols, was approaching the limits of what it could achieve against gunpowder and Janissary discipline. The Ottomans found that cavalry genius and defensive terrain could check even their best armies when they were not fully committed or fully prepared. 30 years later, Selim fixed both problems. He came fully committed and fully prepared. And the Mamluk Sultanate, one of the great powers of the medieval world, ceased to exist in a few months. What does all of this mean for us? It means that the period after a great leader dies is almost always more important than the reign itself. The succession test, the question of whether an institution, an empire, a system can survive the loss of the person who built it, is the real measure of durability. Mehmed II was one of the greatest conquerors in human history. But the Ottoman Empire's most important test was not what he built. It was whether what he built could survive him. It could. Barely. Through Bayezid's steadiness, through Selim's ruthlessness, through the accumulated institutional memory of the Janissaries and the Ottoman administrative system, the empire survived and went on to even greater conquests. And the Mamluks, who survived the Crusades, who stopped the Mongols, who ruled Egypt for 2.5 centuries, were ultimately brought down, not by a single great defeat, but by the failure to adapt fast enough to a changing world. Their cavalry mastery was real and extraordinary. But cavalry mastery in an age of firearms and mobile artillery was a skill in declining demand. The world changed under them, and they could not change fast enough. That pattern, the pattern of a great institution destroyed not by an external shock, but by internal failure to adapt to a new reality, is not ancient history. It is present tense. I want to hear from you. Had you heard about the Ottoman-Mamluk Wars before today? Did you know about Cem Sultan and the 14 years he spent as a political hostage in European courts? Drop it in the comments. This is genuinely one of the most underappreciated geopolitical dramas of the entire 15th century, and it deserves to be known. If this video gave you something, a new angle on history you thought you knew, a set of events that suddenly makes the Age of Discovery or Ottoman expansion make more sense, hit that subscribe button. We find these stories, and we tell them the way they deserve to be told, with the weight and complexity and human drama that the people who lived them actually experienced. There are so many more stories. Every one of them matters, and every one of them is waiting. Remember this: every great empire, at some point, faces the moment after its founder. The moment when the machinery must run without the man who built it. The empires that survive that moment do so not through genius alone, but through the deeper, quieter strength of institutions that outlast any individual. And the empires that fail, they fail because they built everything around one man and forgot to build the thing that would endure when he was gone. Mehmed II built an empire. Bayezid II built the thing that made it last. History remembers the conqueror, but it runs on the consolidator.